All right, this is going to be our final lecture on Castro. I'm recording this on Monday, so it is Memorial Day. So hopefully you guys are not doing schoolwork today. You should be relaxing, hopefully enjoying some stuff with your family. Doesn't look very nice outside right now, but maybe it'll clear up. I don't know. So happy Memorial Day, and we'll get into it here. So we are approaching the final year of Castro's war against Batista. Things are going to unravel pretty quickly here. This is going to be a relatively short presentation. So we're going to kind of get into what caused the revolution to ultimately succeed. And so at the end of 57 and the beginning of 58, we see kind of a quasi ceasefire. Um, there was some more basically like sectarian violence that was taking place throughout Cuba. And some of it Castro was aware of, some of it he wasn't. And it was very disruptive to both sides, actually. And so this is why they kind of stopped this ceasefire. And Batista really wanted to just defeat Castro in the mountains, away from the populace. And this also relates back to an event that was happening in September of 57, where Castro was burning sugarcane fields. Cuba, as we know, because we've covered it pretty extensively, they're a single crop economy. Um, in addition to tourism, sugar was one of the major driving factors of their economy. And so obviously he wanted to try and increase discontent within the society more so than it already existed. And one of the best ways to do that is to make it so that people are hurting economically. So he was burning sugarcane fields because they were, kind of inextricably tied to the government. However, this backfired a little bit, and it's something that I'm surprised Castro didn't necessarily anticipate, because the people who worked the sugarcane fields were peasants, and so by extension, he was kind of harming the very people that he hoped to mobilize. Um, so it kind of disrupted his support for a little bit, and it was something that he ultimately ended up stopping. And so at the beginning of 58, he moved away from the sugarcane fields and looked to engage in logistic disruption. So that means that it would be very hard to move supplies, specifically industries directly located to directly related to the government, as well as the military. And by the middle of January of 58, vehicles, trains, military patrols, they couldn't move in the Manzanillo Bayamo area without being ambushed. And these ambush tactics are constantly used by Castro, and they're really, really effective. Something that we've talked about in past lectures. So in April of 58, Castro announces a total war, which could, in some ways harken back to what we already understand about World War One. Now, it didn't involve tanks or poison gas, but what he meant by that is that he was trying to inflict as much damage upon the enemy as possible. And Castro is feeling himself a little bit in April, and he ordered an island-wide general strike. And so this strike was all across Cuba, and it was in areas that he didn't necessarily have a physical presence in yet, which is kind of the urban centers. And it wasn't really successful. Anybody that was striking was met with severe repression from Batista's goons, his paramilitary forces, the military itself, and it ultimately it failed. So this was kind of a litmus test for Castro as to see what kind of support he had across the island, and it indicated he didn't have enough yet. And so it was a setback for Castro and the people that followed him, and a bit of a win for the Bastianos. So we move into the summer of 58, and this is when the tide really begins to turn. Batista is obsessed with crushing him once and for all. He has the complete and total military on Castro, and he deployed 7,000 troops to the mountains to crush Castro. They thought Castro had 1,000 to 2,000 troops, and he only had 300. So that's a staggering disparity. But it also speaks to kind of how Castro and his followers, specifically from the military perspective, they had this this perception, and that definitely worked in their favor, that they were extremely difficult to defeat. Um, this quote here from one of the generals after they had repeatedly been losing in the mountains because Castro would move around, and it was they almost all of their conflicts happened by ambush. So he says here they can tolerate staying for days at the same place without moving, eating, or drinking water. Um, and it just kind of spoke to the tenacity of who they were and how committed they were. And then something else that's pretty significant to why Batista's offensive ends up failing in the first place is that with each victory by Castro, usually through ambush, um, his troops became demoralized. And so, you know, one way to think of it would kind of be like if like you're a fan of sports and most specifically, I can think of like football. In the game of football, if a team is uh, really kind of imposing their will for the first 3 quarters of the game, you can kind of notice that the one side has way more passion and vigor in what they're doing than the other, and the game just slips away from the other team at a really quick rate. And it's a bit hard to quantify, but it's kind of emotive in how you kind of observe it. And I am extremely used to seeing this type of outcome given the professional football team that I choose to follow. So we have the final campaign here, and this is a military victory at Las Mercedes. And this was a huge victory. Again, we kind of see the same type of outcome that I've been talking about here, where it creates a tremendous amount of excitement and hope for Castro and Batista's army. Their morale was super low, and they kind of in the back of their minds they knew that this is imminent failure. And so we see retreat after retreat through these small battles, some medium, but mainly kind of small battles. But it's kind of like death by a thousand cuts. And I didn't want to spend time going through each and every one because this is not a military history class. But you get the idea that there was a series of small battles because Castro knew that he could not wage a traditional war against Batista. He would most certainly lose. He didn't have the infrastructure, he didn't have the arms, and he didn't have the people to do that. But what he did with these ambush and just generally guerrilla warfare tactics was extremely effective. And so they knew that Batista's army, their morale was so low, they were losing. They could kind of feel that the country was slipping into their favor. So in December of 58, Guevara and Castro, they lead separate columns of troops throughout Santa Clara and Oriente province. This is going to be kind of their last campaign here, and it's ultimately going to be victorious. And by the end of 58, Castro's forces controlled virtually all of Las Villas and Oriente provinces and Camagüey province from its geographical center westward towards Oriente. So this is kind of on the periphery of the island, but they're moving in from the kind of the mountainous jungle, very rural terrains into the urban center. And so Batista's military advisors are keeping him appraised of the situation, and they're not sugarcoating it. In fact, this low morale is extending all the way up to the upper echelons of the military. So they're well aware that they're losing, and it's getting really bad. And Batista's own chief of staff, independent of Batista's knowledge, was kind of pursuing a plan to remove Batista and instill a civilian or a military junta in his place. So they were all worried about getting killed. Okay, so they realized that if they didn't have a plan in place for when Castro seizes power, which they saw as inevitable at this point, then they would just all be executed. So things are really, really rapidly devolving here. And then ultimately on New Year's Eve of 1958, Batista, he leaves Cuba. So this guy Cantillo, that was the military chief of staff. He met with him. Batista explained that, hey, I'm leaving. He was saving his own skin. He would ultimately kind of form this as him doing, quote unquote, what's best for Cuba. And I suppose it was in the long run, but he was doing what was best for himself. and he would be leaving in a few hours, and that Cantillo should assume total control of the armed forces. And in the early morning hours of January 1st, 1959, he delivers this message to the Cuban people that he was leaving the country to avoid further bloodshed, which is a half truth. So this is one of the newspapers here of the Arizona Daily Star. So Batista flies into exile. Again, he goes to the Dominican Republic. And, celebration broke out all across Havana. And then we can also see here that, people are still aware of Castro's he's kind of cozied up to some of these leftist ideals. And he's going to be tangentially kind of associated with communism for the rest of his political career. And that's going to be well supported once he takes office. But at this time, I do want to point out he hasn't really made any outward connections to communism in general. But this is during the Cold War, obviously. So Americans and the government itself is kind of hyper in tune with who this individual is. So at 2 a.m., 2:10 a.m., Batista boards a plane for the Dominican. He takes his family and then those people that had supported him, what they call Batistianos, and they knew that if they stuck around on the island, they'd be killed. There's no doubt about it. So in Cuba, all was lost for Batista, and Fidel Castro had triumphed. So there's going to be some pretty famous photographs I'm going to show you here in a second. But Che and Castro led their columns into Havana on January 2nd. This was like a parade. There were just thousands of people in the street. People were very excited. This was really like a triumphant time for Cuba. And then January 9th, 1959, that's when Castro reaches Havana. And that's kind of officially when he is credited with seizing power, is when he finally reaches Havana. So that's January 9th, 1959, and the revolution is complete. This is one of the most famous photos we have Castro and Che here walking through the streets of Havana, kind of obviously locked arms here. I included this picture because I was trying to convey just the level of popular support that Castro had at this time. Obviously, the Cuban people, they don't know what necessarily is in store for them going forward. They've just lived through a repressive regime. And so there was a sense of relief that this new person seizing power to overthrow that repressive regime obviously wouldn't institute the same type of policies that they feared and dreaded. And so it was elation in Cuba for the most part when Castro seized power. This is kind of to indicate just the level of turnout that people had. It was like, I think sometimes when people, at least personally speaking, when I think of a revolution, this is the type of crowds and the type of fervor that I kind of picture in my mind's eye. And so this is just another incredible photograph of just the popular support that the idea of the Castro Revolution brought upon the people of Cuba. And then this is the first speech that Castro delivered in Havana on January 9th. And again, it's just kind of enigmatic of how, even in this still frame, I think you can kind of see the charisma that Castro exudes and just how captivating he was as an individual. I mean, look at how packed every single person is onto that podium. He really does represent this kind of populist idea, this man of the people. And so it's just a great photo and just a fascinating event to study. So that's it for our methods section, because now that he is in power, the next thing that we would talk about is the maintenance of power. But I'm not really sure how far we're going to get into that. If we do get into it, Mr. Slater and I are going to communicate to you guys how we want to kind of administer our final here. We're trying to do something a little bit different. We've discussed an idea. I don't want to necessarily push it out to you guys quite yet, but it's very engaging, and there's going to be probably a couple different ways that you guys can complete it. But I'm pretty excited about it. So I hope this was interesting to you guys. Obviously, I really wish that we could have done this in class, but I think we made the best with the circumstances at hand. Um, and again, I hope you guys have a great day. And I will end this presentation in the awkward manner that I usually do. Oh.